The iron came down crooked, and Della Coyne threw her whole weight against the tongs to wrench it clear before it could weld itself to the wheel at the wrong angle and cost her a day's work. She had no day to spare. She wrenched it free. The glowing hoop swung wide and dropped against the setting plate with a sound like a cracked bell. A sound that rang out across the yard and the road and the whole town of Ashbury, Kansas, which had long since made up its mind that a woman had no business standing at a forge. Setting a wagon tire is work for two, one to lift the red-hot band, one to seat it true and drown it before it scorches the wheel black. Della had one. She had had one for 22 months, and most evenings her own stubbornness made up the difference, and some evenings it did not. This was one that did not. The light failing, the hoop gone from ready cherry to a sullen dark, the wheel half set, and no one on the road. She stood over the fallen iron, with her shoulders heaving, and the soot running in sweat down her face. 33 years old, and entirely alone, and she let herself feel exactly how alone for the length of one breath. Then she reached for the tongs again, because the only thing worse than the work beating her would be letting the town watch it happen. That was when she heard the boots. "You'll want it a shade hotter," a man's voice said. Not loud. Not telling her how to do her business, just saying a true thing, the way you'd hand someone a tool. "It's lost its color waiting on you. Throw it back in the fire, and I'll catch the far side when it comes out." Della turned. A stranger stood at the edge of the firelight. Tall, lean, road dust gone to mud at the creases of him, a flat cap pushed back, and a canvas roll over one shoulder. He was looking at the fire and the tire and the wheel, reading them, the way a man reads a thing he has read 100 times before. "I didn't ask for help," she said. "No," he agreed, "you didn't." But he set his roll down against the well and shed his coat and rolled his sleeve up an arm corded with the particular muscle a forge builds and nothing else does, and waited by the fire as if the matter were already settled. And because the tire was cooling, and the wheel was worth $4 she did not have, Della shoved the iron back into the coals and worked the bellows until the band came up past cherry into a clean orange, and together, a stranger and a widow, who had never spoken a word to each other before that minute, they lifted it and seated it true and quenched it in a great hiss of steam, and the tire bit down on the wood and held. For a moment neither of them said anything. The steam rose between them and thinned into the dusk. "Frank Coyne's forge," the man said, reading the worn sign over the wide door. "That you?" "His widow." She wiped her hands. "I'm the smith here now, whatever the town says about it." The man looked at the wheel, at the welds along the wagon iron stacked by the wall, at the line of horseshoes she'd drawn out that morning, hanging on their nail. Each one even, each one true. He looked at them the way most men in this town did not bother to look, which was to say he actually looked. "Work's good," he said. It was not flattery, it had the flatness of a fact. Why's the town saying anything about it at all? And that, Della thought, was a longer story than a stranger had any right to. His name was Jonah Teague, and he had been a blacksmith since he was 9 years old, and he was looking for nothing but a week's work and a dry place to lay his head while he found it. He told her this plainly at her kitchen table, a tin plate of beans in front of him and her daughter, watching him from the doorway, with the unblinking judgment of a child of 10. "There's a loft over the forge," Della said. "It's got a stove and a leak I haven't fixed. You can have it for as long as the work lasts, and you'll take your meals here. I can't pay you in coin." She made herself say the rest of it level. "I'd be lying if I told you There was much coin coming in at all just now. I didn't ask after coin, Jonah said. Most men do. I'm not most men, ma'am. And you're not most smiths, so we're square on that. He nodded at the doorway without turning. Your striker there? The girl came forward one step. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn jaw and a burn scar healing pink across the back of one small hand, the mark of a child who is not kept away from the fire, but taught to respect it. I'm Nan, she said. I can work the bellows and I can hold the tongs steady, and I drew 6 of those nails on the nail this week. 6 good ones? 5 good ones, Nan admitted. One went over. Something moved at the corner of Jonah Teague's mouth that in a less weathered face might have grown into a smile. 5 out of 6 is a better day than most grown men have at that anvil, he said. I went over plenty myself at your age. Still do when I'm careless. And Della, watching her daughter stand a little taller, felt something she had not felt across her own kitchen in 22 months, and did not yet have a name she was willing to give it. In the weeks that followed, Della Coyne learned what kind of man Jonah Teague was the way you learn anything true at a forge, which is not by what a man says, but by how he stands at the fire when he thinks the work is the only thing watching him. He was a fine smith. She saw it the first morning when she set him to drawing out tines for a hayfork, and he read the heat by eye alone, never once trusting it to luck, pulling the iron at the clean orange, working it down before it dropped to red, returning it to the coals the instant it lost its life. A poor smith works cold iron and wonders why it cracks. A good smith knows that iron has only a few breaths of working in it, between too hot and too cold, and spends each one like it costs something. You read color well, she told him, because credit, where it was earned, was the one currency she still had plenty of. My master used to put me to the fire blindfold, Jonah said, not looking up from the tine. Said a smith who can only read heat with his eyes, goes blind at 50 and useless at 51. Made me learn it by the feel of it off my face, the smell of the coal, the sound the iron makes when it's hungry to move. He turned the rod. He was a hard old devil. He was right about most things. But it was the second part of him she came to trust more than the skill. It was that he never once tried to take the forge from her. He never reached for a job that was hers to call. He waited to be told where to stand and how hot she wanted it and which weld she meant to make. And then he gave her the thing she had been missing for 22 months, which was not knowledge. She had knowledge to spare, but the simple, brute, two-handed fact of a second skilled body. He was her striker. When she set a chisel on the hot iron and nodded, his sledge came down where she pointed, exactly as hard as she meant, and not 1 ounce harder, again and again, in the old call and answer of the smith and the man who swings for him. She would tap the anvil to set the rhythm and to call the blow, and he would answer, and the bar would move under their 4 hands, the way it had never once moved under her 2. She had forgotten what it was to make the hard things, the wagon tires, the broken plow beams that wanted forge welding, where you bring 2 pieces of iron to the very edge of melting, white and throwing sparks, and brush them with sand for flux, and lap them and strike them so fast and so true that they forget they were ever 2 pieces and become 1. You cannot do that alone. She had been turning that work away for nearly 2 years, sending it down the road to the next town, watching the money go with it. Now it stayed, and Nan stood on her box at the bellows and learned the colors out loud. Cherry, now orange, now it's near to welding, mama. And the forge ran hot from first light, and for the first morning since they laid Frank behind the church, The Coyne forge sounded the way a forge is supposed to sound, which is like a heartbeat with a hammer in it. What it did not have was custom enough to pay the bank. The trouble had a name, and the name was Harlan Stoke. Stoke owned the livery and the freight barn, and a good share of the bank's paper besides, and he was the kind of prosperous that wears a clean collar to watch other men sweat. He had come to Della twice in the first year after Frank died, soft-handed and reasonable, to explain that a forge was no place for a widow, and that he would take the corner lot off her hands at a fair price, which was not a fair price, and free her to do something more suited to her. She had turned him down both times, and on the second the door had been halfway shut before he was finished talking. What Stoke had done after that, he had done quietly, the way the worst things are always done. He had not burned her out or run her off. He had simply mentioned, here and there, to this freighter and that teamster, that he wasn't sure he'd trust a woman to shoe a heavy team for the mountains, that a sprung shoe on a grade was a wagon over the side, that it was nothing personal, only that a man had to think about his stock. And the work had dried up the way a creek dries, not all at once, just less every season, until the only iron coming through the Coyne door was the iron too small for anyone to bother taking elsewhere. Della had known where the talk came from. She had known it the way Frank had taught her to know where a crack starts, by following it back patiently to its quiet beginning. She had known, and she had been unable to do one thing about it, because you cannot forge a man's good opinion of you, and the more she protested, the more she looked like exactly the kind of woman Stoke was painting her to be. It was as Ezra Bell who said it out loud. Ezra was an old freighter with a white beard stained yellow at the corner where his house sat, and 40 years of road in his back, and no patience left for any of it. He brought a mule in for shoeing on a cold Tuesday in the second autumn, and he stood watching Jonah hold the animal's great hoof between his knees, while Della fitted the hot shoe, the acrid smoke curling up as the iron found its seat on the trimmed horn. "That's a good fit," Ezra said. "Hot fit, the way it ought to be." Stoke's man over at the livery shoes 'em cold and quick, and half of 'em come back lame inside a month. He worked his pipe. You know the railroad spurs coming through in the spring. 40 teams a season needing iron, regular, paid on contract. Whole valley's worth of shoeing and tire work in one signature. "I'd heard," Della said evenly, because she had heard, and had not let herself want it. "Stoke means to have it," Ezra said. "He's already telling the railroad men the only smith in Ashbury fit for the work is the one he keeps on his own payroll. Telling them the Coyne place is a widow and a child playing at a dead man's trade." He looked at her, and there was an old man's apology in it, and an old man's anger. "I've hauled freight out of this town since before your Frank was born. I know good iron from bad, and I know a thief who steals with his mouth instead of his hands." "I thought you ought to hear it," said Plain, from somebody, finally. Della set the mule's hoof down. The anger came up in her chest, but it was not the hot kind. It was the cold, clear kind, the kind that has been waiting a long time for somewhere to go. "Thank you, Ezra," she said. That night Jonah found her at the workbench with the lamp turned low, doing the figures she already knew the shape of, the bank's number, and the months left, and the precise distance between them. "You heard the old man," she said, not turning. "I did. Then you know the contract's the whole of it. Win that, and the forge lives. Lose it to Stoke, and I lose the loft you're sleeping in, and the only thing my daughter's ever wanted to be. She set the pencil down, and I can't win it. Not the way it's meant to be lost." Stoke's not going to let a thing be decided on the iron. He'll decide it in rooms I'm not let into, over papers I never see." Jonah was quiet a moment. It was a different quiet than his usual one. She had learned the shapes of his silences by now. The working quiet, and the resting quiet, and the rare one, with something underneath it he wasn't ready to set down. "Then you don't let it be decided in a room," he said finally. "You make them decide it at the fire, in front of the whole town, where the iron does the talking, and Stoke's mouth can't reach. Make it so, the railroad would look a fool choosing the worse smith after they've seen the better one with their own eyes." He held her eyes steady across the lamplight. "I've seen it done. A man who wants a thing settled honest can sometimes force it into the open, if he's willing to risk losing in the open too. That's a long shot." "It is," Jonah agreed, "but you're already losing the sure way. A long shot's the only kind worth taking when the sure thing's a loss." Della studied him a moment in the low lamplight, this stranger who had walked into her yard a season ago and caught the far side of a falling tire and never once tried to take her hammer from her hand. "Why do you care how it comes out?" she asked. "You said a week's work." "It's been a season and more." And there it was, the silence with something underneath it. Jonah turned the lamp up a little, as though he wanted the light on him for this, and not against him. "I had a forge of my own once," he said. "Down in the Nations on a good road before I ever came north. Built it from a lean-to into the best shop in 3 days' ride. Had a wife. Had a boy coming." He said it the way a man walks over old ground, knowing where every stone is. "There was a sickness came through the autumn of '79. Took a lot of folks. Took the 2 of them inside 1 week, and I was so deep in a freight contract. The biggest I'd ever signed, the one that was going to make us, that I didn't send for the doctor in the county seat until the 2nd day she was bad, because the doctor was a day's ride and the contract was due, and I told myself she was strong and it would pass. The fire ticked in the forge. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek. It didn't pass," Jonah said. "And I had the finest forge in 3 days' ride, and a strong box full of contract money, and not one thing in the world I wanted to make anything for. So I shut the door and I started walking, and I've been walking near 4 years, doctoring other men's iron up and down this country, telling myself I was just a man passing through." He looked at the anvil, not at her. "I stopped in your yard because your fire was lit late and I smelled good coal burning. And I stayed because—" He stopped, started again, lower. "Because a woman who'd do the work of 4 for 22 months sooner than let a thief have her husband's forge is the first thing in 4 years I've seen worth stopping for. And a girl learning her colors out loud at the bellows is the second." Della did not say anything. The right thing, with a silence like that, was to let it stand and not rush in to fill it. "I'm not asking you for anything," Jonah said. "I know what you carry. I'd help you win that contract and ride on after, if that's what you wanted, and never say another word about it. But you asked me why I cared, and I'll not lie to you across your own workbench. That's why." For a long moment the only sound was the fire settling. "Don't ride on after," Della said. Her voice was steady, the way it was steady. When she said a weld she meant to hold. "Whatever happens with the contract, don't ride on." Jonah Teague looked at her, and the hard weather of his face eased by some small degree, and he reached across the bench and laid his scarred hand over her scarred hand. Not gripping it, just covering it, the way you'd bank a fire you meant to keep alive through the night. And she turned her hand over under his and let her fingers close. and neither of them said anything else, because at a forge, you learn that the truest joins are the ones made quietly, at the right heat, and then left alone to set. They forced it into the open the way Jonah said, and it cost them to do it. Ezra Bell carried the word to the railroad men, and Ezra had 40 years of credit in his name, and what he told them was simple. Before you sign your iron over to Harlan Stoke on Harlan Stoke's say-so, come stand in the square on Saturday and watch both smiths set a tire and shoe a team, side by side, and choose the work with your own eyes. No man could refuse that, and still call himself fair. And the railroad men were many things, but they were not fools about iron. Because iron was the one thing on a railroad that could not be talked into holding. Stoke could not say no without saying why he was afraid, so Stoke said yes, and smiled his clean collar smile, and sent his livery smith, a quick, careless man named Pruitt, who shod cold and fast, and had never in his life been made to answer for a shoe that sprung a week down the road. Saturday came hard and bright. Half of Ashbury stood in the square. They built 2 ring fires and set 2 anvils, and the railroad men stood with their arms folded, and the work began. Pruitt was fast. Della would give him that, and she watched him with a smith's eye and saw what fast was costing him. He set his tire too cool, in a hurry, and it seated loose and would ride loose and would work the wheel apart over a hard winter, though it would look fine today, and today was what he was shoeing for. He shod the team cold, rasping the shoes to a rough fit, banging them on, and the mules shifted and complained under his hand, because a cold shoe forced onto a hoof is a lie the animal can feel even when the man cannot. Della took her time. She was aware of the crowd, and then she forgot it, the way you forget everything at the fire that is not the fire. She brought her tire up clean, and even all the way around, no cool spots. And she and Jonah lifted it together and dropped it true, and quenched it in one long hiss. And when the steam cleared, the railroad men came and put their hands on the wheel and could not move the tire a hair, because it had shrunk down into the wood the way iron does when a smith respects it. Then she shod the team hot. She trimmed each hoof and read it, using what Frank had shown her years back and the surer touch she'd worked out on her own since. And she fitted each shoe to the foot instead of forcing the foot to the shoe, and the smoke came up sweet and acrid as the hot iron kissed the horn and found its exact seat, and the big mules stood quiet under her hands, one after another. Trusts a thing that did, because an animal trusts a thing that fits. Nan worked the bellows and called the colors clear and unafraid, in front of the whole town that had spent 2 years pretending her mother was playing at a dead man's trade. And Jonah swung the sledge when she called the blow, and stepped back when the work was hers alone, and never once stood between her and what the town could see. When it was done, an old freighter's mule stood square and easy on 4 hot-fit shoes, and a wheel sat in the dust that 2 grown men could not budge the tire on, and the thing had been decided in the one court, Harlan Stoke, could not adjourn. The railroad man, a spare, gray fellow with ink on his fingers and no patience for anybody's reputation but irons, walked the length of both wheels twice. He lifted each mule's foot, Della's and Pruitt's both. Then he looked at Harlan Stoke, not unkindly, the way you look at a man whose game you have just seen the whole of, and he said, "Loud enough for the square. I'll put my teams on the work I can see, not the work I'm told about. Mrs. Coyne, if you'll have the contract, the railroad would be obliged." Harlan Stoke's clean collar did not save him from the silence that followed, which was the silence of a town remembering, all at once and a little ashamed, what it had let itself be told. They were married in the spring, in the churchyard, not far from where Frank Coyne lay, by a circuit preacher who came through Ashbury once a month. It was a small wedding. Ezra Bell stood up as a witness in a clean shirt, his pipe left respectfully in his pocket, and Nan held the ring until it was wanted, and the cottonwoods along the creek were just coming into leaf. The forge ran hot through that year, and the years after it. The railroad teams came regular, 40 a season, and then more, and the iron that had once gone down the road to the next town stayed in Ashbury, where it was made best. And the bank's number went down, and then it went to nothing. And Della stood at the teller's window the day she paid the last of it, and watched the man draw his line under the zero, and thought of all the nights the figures had sat on her chest, and walked out into the Kansas sun, standing on ground that was wholly her own. Harlan Stoke kept his livery. He still drove his buggy past the Coyne forge on his way to the freight barn. He did not stop, and he did not look, and after a while he was simply a man the town had once listened to, and listened to no longer, which is the only justice some men ever face, and more than they expect. And Nan grew. She drew her colors out loud, less and less, because she no longer needed to say them to know them. And one morning in her 13th year, she forge-welded a chain link, closed on her own, white heat and flux and 4 clean blows, and held it up to the light without a crack in it. And Jonah looked at the link and then at the girl and said only, "That'll hold," which from a smith is the whole of a blessing. There is an evening late in their 3rd autumn, together, that I want to leave you with. The forge is banked for the night, and the day's iron is cooling on the rack. Della Coyne, Della Teague, these years now, stands in the wide door with a cup going cold in her hands, watching the last light go copper over the Kansas grass. Inside, Jonah is showing Nan how to dress the face of the anvil, and the girl is arguing with him about it, respectfully and at length, the way she argues about everything now, and he is letting her, because a smith who cannot be argued with raises a striker and never a smith. Here is the thing I have come to believe, telling stories like this one. We tell ourselves that what a struggling person needs is rescue. Someone to ride in and lift the whole weight off at a stroke. It is almost never what they need, and it is almost never what they get. Della Coyne did not need a man to save her forge. She was the smith. She had always been the smith. What she had been denied was not skill and not courage, both of which she had in more measure than the town that doubted her. What she had been denied was the simplest thing in the world and the hardest to ask for. A second pair of hands that would swing where she pointed and step back when the work was hers, and a town willing to look at what she made instead of listening to what it was told. That is not rescue. A man did not save Della Coyne. A man caught the far side of a falling tire and stayed to swing the sledge and let the whole square watch her do the rest. The saving she did herself at her own fire, the way she had been doing it all along. Only now there was someone to bank the coals with her when the long day was finally done. You can mend iron and you can mend a life by the same law if you've the patience for it. You bring the broken thing to the right heat, not too cold or it cracks, not too hot or it crumbles. You hold the two ends close, and then you strike, true and unhurried, and you trust the join, and you leave it be to set. Thank you for standing at this fire with me a while, and with Della and Jonah and a girl learning her colors out loud on the Kansas grass. If you found something here worth keeping, stay a while longer. There are more of these stories where this one came from, and I'd be glad of your company down the next road. The forge is banked, and the iron is cooling, and the door is shut against the cold.